Hello everyone. I want to share with you the political transformation that I went through from being a liberal to an anarchist. So what were the factors that changed my mind and how did that happen over time? My first political stances were pretty straightforward. When I was very young, my understanding was just we should oppose dictatorship, whether that's fascism or what went under the name communism. And my understanding was that Western liberal democracy was the kind of only alternative to dictatorship. I was raised by liberal parents and that's what I picked up. In my teenage years, I went through my edgy new atheist phase of being really anti-religious. I read Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and I would like to think that my new atheism came out of frustration with superstition and unsubstantiated beliefs, but I didn't really think very deeply about it. Currently, I think new atheism is a very serviceable ideology to power, because, it has this guise of being very critical, saying things like, oh, look at all the wars that religion causes, as if wars are caused by kind of differences in abstract ideas, as opposed to material realities like institutions wanting to gain control of resources. Anyway, I was really anti-religious. Around that time, I was also beginning to learn about social policy, issues like gay marriage, and it seemed wrong to me that homosexual people were being treated as less than heterosexual people by institutions. And I didn't like the idea of religion being used as a basis for imposing on other people. The same goes for abortion, although I didn't really think as much about that, but I had a sense that people should have a right to control their own bodies. And I guess around that time, I had a pretty vague sense that there should be a general progression in society towards more freedom. People being able to do what they want with their own lives, so long as they aren't hurting other people. My view was that we should be going towards a free society, and at the time I viewed conservative religion as being the main obstacle to that. Now, as a teenager, I was also an anti-feminist. I didn't really understand what feminism was, I hadn't read anything. For me, this was at a time in my life where I was very socially isolated and I struggled a lot socially interacting with people, women included, and I felt pretty embarrassed about that. And I guess what was appealing about anti-feminism was that it was people that were kind of saying to me, hey, you're such a nice guy and it's all these women's fault, they were all oppressing you with their feminism, blah, blah, blah. And I found that kind of comforting. It took me a while to let go of that. Later, I became interested in drug laws. The fact that cannabis is illegal and alcohol isn't is ridiculous when cannabis is safer than alcohol. To me, this just made no sense. Eventually, I developed an opposition to the criminalisation of all recreational drugs, because it seemed that this policy of criminalisation was making drugs less safe, and in the case of addicts, criminalising people with a medical problem. And I was very concerned that the government was less interested in keeping people safe and more interested in punishment. Another issue was the monarchy. I just couldn't believe that I'm living in a society in which some people are just born with the right to rule. And I also felt that the way the royal family were discussed in the news media was that they seemed to just shower these people with praise. And I saw all of the flag waving as being really blindly servile, and I saw it as being a sinister, conformist element in what was supposedly a free society. I also became interested in electoral reform. I hated the transparent elitism of the House of Lords. I learned about how the first-past-the-post system leads to rule between two parties as a result of the spoiler effect. And I didn't like how that seemed to marginalise the public because people can't vote for who they really want to vote for. So that annoyed me. So then I thought, well, what about proportional representation? Isn't that a fairer system? There came a point where I sort of hit this wall as a liberal, and the wall was this. In a democratic society, the public should run their own affairs and determine the thrust of policy. And even with a system like proportional representation, the party system itself is still sort of centralising power in the hands of a small minority of people. How can I reconcile my belief in the public running their own affairs with this centralisation of power in the hands of a small minority? And you say, well, the public votes for them and that gives them a mandate, but I just kind of thought, really? That's the extent of our democracy. It's every few years the public ratifies the right of a small minority of people to make the decisions, but by and large they're disempowered politically. And one of the reasons I left liberalism was that I just couldn't be satisfied with that. To turn to the economic sphere, my first exposure to economic issues was learning about the bedroom tax. Now, this is a benefit cut, where if you're living in social housing and you're deemed to have a spare room, then you get a reduction in your housing benefit. A housing benefit is a means-tested benefit, so you have to be poor to get it. And there aren't smaller houses for people to move into, and also, most of the people affected by this are registered disabled. So it's essentially just an attack on poor and disabled people. I learned about the programme of austerity being pursued by the UK government and its social consequences. For example, 500,000 people relying on food banks, people committing suicide after having their benefits sanctioned, and also the slave labour schemes where people have to work for their benefits that are less than the minimum wage. I came to the understanding that in a free society, nobody should be forced to struggle with poverty and destitution. So I really started to move leftward economically. I thought we really need to provide people with free access to necessities and the means of life so that they're able to pursue their interests and passions. People naturally want to develop their capacities, and I think the economic system should maximise those opportunities for people. I had a vague sense that the right of people to have free access to essential necessities trumps the right of a small minority of people to hoard vast amounts of wealth. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, I should support a large welfare state that provides for people. But I still had this niggling problem in the back of my mind about the wall that I hit with the party system and the need for a solution to that. So I was kind of stuck in this place where I had a serious problem with the centralisation of decision-making in the hands of a few that happens with the state apparatus, and I also had a big problem with economic inequality and lack of access to necessities. You know, I didn't want to have islands of wealth in a sea of poverty. So I really needed a solution to both of these issues. My own experience of the phenomenon of student debt was key to my radicalisation. If you want to eat, you need a job, and if you want a decent job, you need an education. So I kind of set about getting a musical education, which I'm still in the midst of, and because of the lack of free access to necessities, I've had to take out a student loan and go into debt. And it kind of dawned on me that the market system doesn't really value the pursuit of music. So if I want to pay off this debt, it's likely that I'm going to have to get a job that I hate working for a boss. I'm going to have to spend a lot of time just following orders. People spend the majority of their waking lives in the workplace, and it's an institution where you do what the boss says or you get fired. You do the work and the boss makes the profit. And that's where the inequalities in the society come from. Wealth gets pumped up into the hands of a small minority of people who own the means of production. So we have this economic disenfranchisement where people don't have a say over their lives in the workplace. And I looked back on my education, my experience of high school, where people are treated as empty vessels into which knowledge is poured and then regurgitated in standardized tests that they get graded on. And I kind of thought, people aren't being taught to be active participants in a democratic society. This is training for obedience to authority and subservience. It's preparation for the workplace. And I also learned about the incessant monitoring of workers from companies like Amazon, and I just thought this is a huge threat to human freedom. We are living in a society in which the great majority of people are disenfranchised politically and economically, and the education system trains people to accept this disenfranchisement from a very early age, and it's in the interests of political and economic elites to keep it that way. And I left liberalism because I didn't like the fact that the economic system we have forces people to submit to authoritarian control. I didn't want that for myself, and I didn't want it for other people in the same situation. So I wanted to get rid of capitalism. In looking at the alternatives, I learned about the Soviet Union and how the state acted against workers by destroying workers' councils and having a system in which the functions of the capitalist class are undertaken by the state. And To me, this just seemed like another kind of tyranny and not a viable solution. I rejected vanguard parties fairly swiftly because it just seemed like an authoritarian way of doing things, and it wouldn't lead to the kind of society that I wanted to see. What I was really seeking was a kind of socialism where power isn't centralised in the hands of a state. So I learned about the Spanish Revolution from 1936 to 1939, and it was a successful attempt at establishing stateless socialism. And much of the industry was taken under popular control, and worker self-management was organised across the society. And everything that I've been taught, that anarchy is chaos, it's disorder, it's everybody running around killing each other, there's no organisation, it goes against human nature, all of that was exposed as a lie. It was a decent, well-functioning, free and democratic society. Learning about the Spanish Revolution showed me that there is a world beyond capitalism and that we can aspire to something more than just representative democracy. We can have democracy directly and in every aspect of our lives. To me, that's a much more empowering vision of society than anything that I came across in my time as a liberal. And the only reason that this society didn't last was that other societies, hierarchical societies, fascist and Stalinist, could not tolerate it and crushed it by force. Eventually I had to come to terms with the fact that if the working class attempts to gain control of the means of production, then the capitalist class and the state aren't going to give up their power. If working class self-emancipation becomes a large enough threat, they are going to suppress it violently in order to protect their interests. And so I hit another wall. And this time the wall was, if I'm against the right of the working class to use violence in the interests of establishing democratic control of the economy and the society, then I'm giving the capitalist class and the state a permanent veto on the emancipation of the species. What are the costs of that? The costs are business as usual continues. The public are marginalised. People don't have control over their own lives. We don't get to live in a society that we can even remotely call democratic. An elite minority is allowed to run things in their own interests, and the society has to bear the cost of social inequality. States perpetuate their own power through military conquest, and we race towards ecological catastrophe as institutions put profit before human needs and care for the environment, ultimately threatening the survival of the species. To me, these costs are unacceptable. Ultimately, I value popular democracy more than the right of a privileged few to maintain this state of affairs to the detriment of the species. Because the ruling class will use armed force to protect its interests, I think that violence will be an unfortunate necessity in overthrowing them. They are going to use violence whether we like it or not, and I think that the working class has the right to defend itself against this, especially under the current conditions in which these institutions present a threat to human survival. To turn to the issue of feminism, I was initially more reactionary than liberal on this issue, and eventually, as I learned about anarchism, I found that it's not just about opposing capitalism in the state, but it's about opposing hierarchy in general and in all aspects of life, and that includes the hierarchies of men over women and non-binary people, and I couldn't consistently support that as an anarchist. So that's a rough picture of how I transitioned from a liberal to an anarchist. It was a case of seeing more and more things wrong with the society and identifying systems that stand in the way of human freedom. There was dissatisfaction with authoritarian social policies, then dissatisfaction with the kind of first past the post system, then dissatisfaction with the electoral system as a whole, and then there was dissatisfaction with, austerity and economic inequality, and then I started to see the workplace as an authoritarian institution. Comparing and contrasting the Soviet Union with revolutionary Spain, it seemed to me that anarchism was not only the most viable alternative to the capitalist system, but also a much more free and democratic society than Western liberal democracy. I think society should be as democratic as we can possibly make it, and evidence shows that we can make our society much more democratic than it currently is. This has been Libertarian Socialist Rants. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Many thanks to my contributors on Patreon: Brandon Halkus Tisher, Deviath Fur, Flagburner, Google Hushabye Valley or I'll Give You a Swirly, Jeremy Vogt, Joe Martin, Michael Norling, Patrick Gordon, Richard Pearson, and XXX Swagmaster 420 XXX.